This week, aside from COVID, there will be a lot of celebrations honoring our vets. Veterans Day is different from Memorial Day. Sometimes we confuse the two. Veterans Day is the day, well, it's also called Armistice Day, but it's the day that we celebrate those people who have fought in a war for the greater good and that peace has arrived. On the other hand, Memorial Day in May is a time when we remember all of those men and women who have offered the ultimate sacrifice, which is their physical life on this earth. And so they're two very different days to remember. But we celebrate this week with stars and stripes and spangled banners, and the scripture of Amos tells us that God really is not interested in all our parades, in all our feasts and festivals and music of trumpets and bassoons and flutes. God really isn't interested in any of that. God, in fact, according to Amos, is interested in something great, something much greater. I don't believe God has a problem at all with celebration, with festivals and music, but not yet. The celebrations can only happen until justice happens. When justice happens, the celebrations should be grand. So, if we are not to have these celebrations until we experience justice, we have to ask ourselves, well, where does justice fit in this whole picture of celebrating our veterans? Well, something I shared with you last Veterans Day, I would like to share with you once again. And that is that I believe that veterans are an example for all of us of what it means to put others before self. Now, this is actually also what Christ teaches, Christ modeled. Christ put others before himself, even to the point of death. It was more important that he fight for justice for others than to live until he's 90 years old. And so this characteristic that vets offer us that is a model for us. Can you imagine the world if we all put our neighbors before ourselves? If we all put a greater good before ourselves? That we weren't so afraid of dying that we would fight for what is right? Wouldn't that be a wonderful world? I think so. But yet, these men and women who model for us how to be unselfish for a greater good, we have to ask ourselves sometimes, well, how do we treat these people? How do we treat these men and women who model for us the way of, quite literally, the way of fighting for justice? How do we treat these people? And Jesus shows us what it means and what it looks like to put our neighbors before ourselves. And it's a risky thing. Jesus was an example of what a risk it is to lift up our neighbors before ourselves. And so the question I have for you on this Veterans Day that's just around the corner is, how do we respond to the men and women who have sacrificed their lives and maybe their livelihood and their time with their family and all sorts of things? How do we honor these men and women? Now, I think that it's very true that many veterans are treated appropriately. They are honored appropriately. They are lifted up as people who understand what sacrifice means. And we celebrate how they model for us what it means to be brave and courageous. But I think that you would agree that not all vets are treated so appropriately. Unfortunately, Amos tells us that God is not interested in pageantry, in these veterans' parades, in any of these celebrations. None of this is pleasing to God. What's pleasing to God is justice. It's justice. So let's think a moment about justice. You know, we as Christians, we're called to seek those on the margins. Jesus would call them the least of these. To seek those on the margins. You know, so very often when we talk about people on the margins, we immediately go to the people who are a part of the LGBTQ community. Or we might go to the people who are living in poverty. Or the people who are living in the margins might have well, I remember in the 80s, those people who had AIDS, they were certainly pushed out to the margins. People who have professions that are quite what some people might call offensive are pushed to the margins. But I think that it's very, very often, at least it is for me, and I really don't believe that I'm always the only one who thinks a certain way. So it's very, very often for me to not remember a huge demographic that lives on the margins. And that demographic is our vets. Now, certainly not all our vets. Like I said, some veterans are treated appropriately and their needs are met and they're able to live good lives as productive citizens. But not everybody. Did you know that 37,000 vets are homeless today? Did you know that an average of 17 veterans commit suicide every single day? Did you know that more than 180,000 veterans are incarcerated? Did you know that more than 20% of all the veterans in this country suffer from addiction? When Amos tells us that God is not interested in our celebrations, but he's interested in justice, what he's telling us is that those veterans who are on the margins there is no justice as long as there are veterans who are on the margins. And there is no justice until all the veterans are treated with love and compassion and empathy. And then all of these men and women are cared for in the way they were promised they were going to be cared for when they signed their name on that contract to join one of the forces. When we include all of those men and women, those veterans who are on the margins, that is when there's time for celebration, but not until that time. I told you last week that Ron gave me a painting that truly touched my soul. And I would like to share that with you right now. So here, what I am imagining is a painting of a homeless vet. Now, I think that your first glance at this painting, you might not see the subject right away. And it's kind of like driving by someone who's holding up a cardboard sign that says veteran asking for help, or even just asking for help. And many of us, including myself, we turn a blind eye and we choose to not see the injustice before us as we continue driving through that red light or stop sign. Now, I don't want you to look away from the painting. I want you to look a little bit more deeply than you are. And I want you to search for the subject. Some of you might see it right away, and some of you might need a moment. My guess is that as you see this painting, your eyes are going to naturally move to those darkest shapes, and your mind is going to try to make sense of what those shapes actually are. And then you might recognize, oh look, there's a hand. There's a hand, and that hand, oh, I see the face. I see the face, I see the hand holding the face. And then you might look deeper into the face of this, what I consider a homeless vet. You look deeper into the face of this person and you ask yourself, is this the face of a person who is living their best life? Is this a person who has an expression of joy or contentment? Is the face here that Ron painted, does it express the knowledge that he is loved? Now, I witness this man's downcast stare, and I witness his hand holding his head as if his head is so heavy that if he pulled his hands away, he would fall to the ground. This man, in my mind, this vet who chose to sacrifice himself for a greater good, like Jesus sacrificed himself for a greater good, has been crucified in some other kind of way. Now, please don't hear that I am comparing the homeless vets with Jesus. The parallel that I'm trying to draw here is that the characteristic of sacrificing self for something greater is one of the characteristics of Jesus. And when Jesus did that, we all know what happened. Although the man in this painting still may have breath in his lungs, he is in many ways left for dead. He is invisible. And if we do see him, if we do witness this man lying on the street, blocking a stairway, what we see is maybe someone who is dirty, someone who is probably dangerous. We make assumptions that this person is on drugs, or we might even go so far as to blame him for being where he is. All he has to do is pick himself up by his bootstraps. I thank Ron because this painting, it reminds me to open my eyes to the invisible. And once I see when the invisible becomes visible to me, then I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to work to bring about justice for this human being who deserves dignity, who deserves respect, who deserves our compassion, who does not deserve our judgment. When every one of these men and women are treated with the kind of respect and honor and lifted up as having the characteristic that we all must strive for, there should be no parades. There should be no feasts. None of the celebrations can happen. They won't please God until all are lifted. Then there's a celebration. Now, last thing I want to say is that in seminary, they taught me, they drilled into our heads, never, ever, ever offer a message without sharing the good news. And so here is your good news. The situation that we are in right now that I have just described to you, we can call that an opportunity. We have the opportunity to love our neighbor, to care for our neighbor, to share respect, to not judge our neighbor, to lift up our neighbor. And by doing that, we are loving God. By loving our neighbor, we are loving God. And that is what pleases God. That is what is worth our hallelujahs and our amens. We have an opportunity. What are we going to do with that opportunity? We can work together. We can work together to bring about justice and let it flow like an everlasting stream. We can do that together.